Hive and Code Bar Helsinki. Nice to see y'all. My name is Daniel Yuschick, and I'm pretty excited to be speaking about stuff that I enjoy most on the web, which is HTML and CSS. And specifically, we're going to be talking about kind of how those two tools are evolving to really not just change themselves with the modern way that we build web, but also kind of changing the front end in general. I think it's kind of changing the way we work entirely. So we're going to get a little bit more into that. First, we're going to look briefly, a little bit of background. I've been working in the front end for about 15 years. And I've been writing HTML and CSS for probably 2 decades. And the weird thing about time is every time I do a talk, I get older. And it's pretty difficult to deal with sometimes. But I just started last month at Posty as the lead design systems developer. So shout out, thank you. Oh, man. Appreciate that. I'm quite stoked about it. Yeah, getting to build a really big system with really great scale and effect. So yeah, I'm stoked. And yeah, part of my job is writing a whole lot of HTML and CSS. Adjusting some knobs, we good. Yeah, lots of HTML, lots of CSS with a passion for accessibility as well. So design systems is where I belong. So we're talking about HTML and CSS tonight and how they're evolving. But like I said, we're going to start with a background story, which sort of serves as the overarching theme of tonight and how I believe that the front end itself is changing. Once we get through that, we're going to define that story, define that context. Then we're going to start looking at some CSS things, some HTML things. We'll recap, because I'm going to throw a whole lot of things at you tonight. And then, yeah, we'll take questions at the end. We'll experiment some things. And, you know, we have lots of time tonight, so we can really dig into some things that maybe I don't cover deeply enough here. One last piece of housekeeping. Does anyone here know the TV show Psych? It's on Netflix. Anyone? Okay, cool. I've done this this is the 4th time I'm doing this, and I've never had more than 1 hand go up. So tonight, new record, 0. It's an old show. It's on Netflix. I highly recommend it. A guy pretends to be a psychic, and he helps solve crime with the cops. Good times, funny, all that stuff. It was on for 8 seasons, and in every episode of every season, they hit a pineapple in the episode. And back in the day when they were showing the episodes live for the new time, you'd be able to go online and fill out a form if you found the pineapple, and you could register to win a prize. So because I love Psych and good vibes, we're going to do the same thing tonight. I have a pineapple hidden somewhere in my slides tonight. So if you find it, shout. Because last time someone raised their hand and I thought they were asking a question. So I was like, sorry, we'll take questions at the end. And then someone else had to be like, no, he got the pineapple. So shout, get my attention. First person to get my attention will win a prize. So there's always one, and we found them. Not this one. This one doesn't count. Always one. All right, so sort of our agenda for tonight ready. We got the rules of the game in place here. I think we can get started with the introduction and sort of the perspective that I'm bringing into this whole talk and the background story that sort of fuels the whole thing for me. Like I said, I've been working on the front end for 15 years, and in that time, I've had a lot of jobs. We're developers. We change jobs a lot. That's kind of our thing. So I want to go through a couple of quotes that I've been told throughout my career that have really stuck with me. A little bit closer.
Yeah, now it's
okay. I feel like there's a little feedback, but okay. Yeah. So a couple of quotes that I've been told throughout my career that have really stuck with me. And the first one, not a real developer, I'm just an HTML guy. So this was particularly rough. This was a manager back in 2013-ish, and in front of all the other dev team and all the designers just kind of stood up and just kind of shit on me in front of everyone for just being an HTML guy because I didn't know MySQL at the time. Still don't, fun fact. He made it a point to really kind of belittle me for just being an HTML guy, focusing on the front end and having that passion there and coming from that design background. I'm not a real developer. I mean, we still argue today, is HTML a programming language? I don't care if it is or isn't. I like it. So that was one quote. The second quote I was told was 2017. I just started a new job, meeting my teammate that we're going to do this project together. And he says, my CSS will be better than his because he's more of a programmer. Good call. He's more of a programmer, so my CSS should be better than his. And like, I get it. You're maybe trying to give me a compliment, but you don't have to be a dick at the same time. You know, and these are two quotes that really stuck with me. 2013, 11 years ago, I can still picture that day happening. 2000, still that exchange. I can still picture standing in the office, meeting everyone for the first time and being told this. So the first point that I kind of want to make here is that words matter. Whenever you're meeting someone, whenever you're in a professional environment and you're working, especially if you're in any form of a position of power, your words matter greatly. We're 11 and 6 years here, and I can still picture those days. So what you say to people, how you interact with people, how you treat people matters. And I remember these moments more than the actual work that I was doing. So the code doesn't really matter from these jobs. What sticks with me were these interactions. So words matter. The second point, and the point that kind of drives this whole talk, is I believe that the front end is fracturing. For so long, the front end has always just kind of been, you know, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. But then JavaScript kind of started doing everything. So now front-end developers sort of start having to do a little bit of everything. Again, been doing this for a long time. I lived through the transition from when you were a webmaster and when that split, because the iPhone happened, you needed responsive design. You needed people who were specifically trained on the front end and CSS and all that stuff. So webmasters and web developers became front-end developers. That field split. And I believe we're living through a similar split right now. I think we're introducing, and we're seeing this more now in the past year, is we're getting this new field of design engineering. Now, whether I'm looking for a job or not, I'm on LinkedIn just about every day, every other day, looking at what jobs are out there. I want to know what companies are hiring, what are the conditions, what are the expectations. I just want to have an idea of what's happening in our field. And I'm seeing a slight uptick in jobs that are design engineering. These are people like me. These are people who sometimes work on the design team, or at least very closely to the design team, and they're expected to write HTML, CSS, and like UI level JavaScript. There's generally an accessibility component to this as well, and there's people who really specialize and focus on the front of the front end. Meanwhile, I think front-end development as the title and front-end developer as the title is really blending and merging into full-stack development. It's alarming how many front-end developer positions I see that are also expecting some type of Go or PHP or some type of like back-end language or DevOps experience. It's not just writing front-end code. You're not just working the UI. Because JavaScript is at every stage of development, you're kind of expected to know every stage. So front-end is sort of blurring with full stack development. And I believe this is the fracture that we're seeing. We're going to be seeing UI developer / design engineer. And I believe front-end engineering is going to start blurring the line with full stack development. I get it. What the fuck am I talking about? Right? I'm just going, you're here to learn about HTML and CSS, and I'm just going on about past trauma, right? It happens. But what I'm talking about is I believe that the way that we work and the tools that we work with drive each other. So as we're going to see tonight, the way that HTML and CSS are evolving to accommodate modern web development is kind of fueling how we actually develop in the industry itself. And because the industry itself is changing and how we develop is changing, HTML and our tools also change to accommodate. It's a cycle. So as we see this fracturing happening in the front end and we see the evolution of front end development, our tools are accommodating. And because our tools are accommodating, we can now do more and our work changes with it. So all of this stuff fuels each other and drives each other. So this is to give a little bit of background on sort of where front end has been, where I think it is, and where I believe it's going. And I think with that, we can start looking at some actual code stuff. I know, finally. Look at some CSS stuff and see how new features in HTML and CSS are replacing things that we used to do in JavaScript for years. But JavaScript is sort of being pulled a bit more, moved into sort of the middle stack of the front end and into like the back end stack of the front end. And a lot of the UI work is being moved into the UI languages. So we're going to look at a few topics here with CSS. And the first one we're going to get into is keyword transitions. This is a little 2-for-1. We got a couple things in here. The first property that we want to look at tonight is called interpolate size. And what this allows you to do is in CSS, you have keyword values, like if you think of none, like display none, or you have things like max width or max content or fit content. You have these values that you can use in CSS that aren't a number or things like that. It's just a keyword within CSS itself. And we have this example here where we have a navigation of anchor tags, and we have a transition on the width. So one point that I forgot to cover is these code samples that we're looking at tonight are going to be using what's called logical CSS. So we're not going to be seeing values like width and height. We're going to be seeing values called block size and inline size. So all you need to know for these samples is inline means width, block means height. So that's one caveat out of the way. So in this example, we have our anchor tags in our navigation. And then whenever we hover, we want to change this inline size, this width. And we just want to change it to fit the content that's in there. So it might be different for every link because the content within each link is going to be different. But we still want to transition this. We just want to kind of slide out and kind of be a smooth interaction. So we have our default inline size. We have our transition. And then on hover and focus visible, we update the inline size. However, we end up getting an experience like this, where it doesn't transition. It isn't a smooth interaction. It just jumps. And that's because CSS doesn't understand how to transition the value of max content, a keyword. It doesn't understand what max content means. It's not a number that it can calculate and transition to. It's just a word. So it really struggles to understand how to go from point A to point B when you're using a keyword. Enter interpolate size. We have a new property called interpolate size with the value of allow keywords. I fully expect this to become a standard line in most CSS resets, because it almost feels like this should just be not even a feature you have to add. It should ultimately just be a default thing that the browser does for us. But we use interpolate size allow keywords. And what this allows us to do now is it gives CSS, it sort of plugs into CSS to now take these keywords like max width or max content. And CSS is now able to sort of understand what that means. It's able to transition or transform max content into a numeric value that we're now able to transform. It does it behind the scenes. You don't have to change your code. We can use the exact same code we just had. But all we add now is interpolate size, allow keywords, and now we get that smooth transition that we're hoping for. It doesn't matter that each anchor tag has a different width with it based on the word. We're now able to transition to that max content keyword by using interpolate size. So this kind of blew my mind when I saw it. And I think it's, like I said, I think it's going to be part of every CSS reset moving forward if the browsers don't just end up building this in themselves by default. So I think it's incredibly powerful. But I did say this was a 2-for-1 because we can still do more with this. Let's say auto. I think we are familiar with the auto keyword in CSS. And here again, we have a container. If we think about like an accordion, we have block size defined. And then whenever we want it expanded, we just set the block size to auto because the content inside might be different. We can't really like define a set pixel value to change or like to open the accordion. So we just want to open it to expanded, or we want to mark expanded to auto. And again, we have transition set. So our expectation is we can transition from height of 100 pixels to height of auto, but we can't. Again, this is something that I fought with for 2 decades of trying to transition to block auto, and it wasn't until interpolate size that now we're able to actually do that. CSS is able to take that auto value, transform it into a numeric value, and now transition to it. So all those challenges we've had with animating and transitioning to auto heights and auto widths, we can now actually do that by using the interpolate size property. So I think this was really, really, really cool. And we can go even one step further still, because CSS not only can transform these keywords into numeric values and transition to them, it can also transform them into numeric values and then calculate based off of those. So we can have this example as well, where again, we have the anchor tags within our navigations. And we change one thing here. We're using the CSS function called calc size. And we're able to arguments here. The first one we have set to max content. This is the keyword that we want to calculate off of. This is going to be our base. So then whenever we pass max content into the first argument here, our second argument kind of renames that as size. So in this example, we pass max content as the base keyword we want to use. And then in the second, we want to say, take the size, which is max content, and add 3 rem to it. So this will allow CSS to take max content, transform it into a number value, and then add 3 more rems to that value, just by using the calc size function. So now when we look at that same demo, we hover, and now we're transforming to not only the max content of these items, but the max content with 3 more rems to that, relative to that keyword. So now we can do a whole lot of stuff with this and just make CSS more powerful. Because before, we would maybe have to do something in JavaScript where before we actually expanded the accordion, we had to calculate what that DOM element size was, pass that in as maybe a custom property or a hard-coded style tag or style attribute on the element to transition to it then. That logic that we had to do before is now just in CSS as one property of interpolate size or one function as calc size. So pretty powerful stuff, I think. That was keyword transitions. And now we can get into form validation, the most boring topic probably on the web, form validation. But it's incredibly important, and CSS has just made it better. Now, again, for decades, I've been using the pseudo classes of valid and invalid. And here we can use these on an input field, like an email input field. And whenever in that field, if the value they type in is an invalid email address, we want to set it to red. But if the email address that they're entering in there is a valid email address, let's set the input border to green. Right? It's a pretty common practice that we see all the time. Except when we use the valid and invalid CSS pseudo classes, we kind of get this weird behavior where it's validating live. When I actually show as valid until I actually have a valid email address in there, but until I have that, it shows as invalid. So as soon as I start interacting with this field, it marks the border is red because, hey, this isn't a valid email address. So it starts making you feel like you're doing something wrong before you've actually done anything. And it's a pattern that we've had to work around for a really long time because we're supposed to be able to use CSS for this stuff. But this just doesn't create the user experience that we're expecting, or a user experience that is even conducive to wanting to fill out a form or just basic interactions on the web. So enter JavaScript, right? Filling in all the gaps of the UI. Where we would do something like add, there's a dog? Shout, that's cool. All right, shout out dog. All right. we used to use JavaScript to fill in these gaps. So we would add maybe an event listener to our input field and say, hey, whenever the person focuses out, whenever they move their focus away from this field, now let's run our validation script on it. So we weren't able to actually leverage CSS. We had to sort of supplement it and replace it because what it provided us wasn't good enough. So we had to use JavaScript to fill in those gaps. But CSS has evolved. How we work on the front end has evolved. And now it's kind of confusing, but instead of using the valid and invalid pseudo classes in CSS, we can now use the user valid and user invalid pseudo classes in CSS. And these function the exact same way with one caveat, and that they will wait until a significant amount of interaction has occurred before triggering. I think those are the words used in the MDN docs, significant amount of interaction, something like that. So it's not necessarily on focus out, but it's not kind of tied. It's tied to something, but essentially whenever you use these two pseudo classes now of user valid and user invalid, we get the experience that we're expecting, where I'm able to type in this field, it's all good. Oh. Shall I give him a round of Absolutely.
I didn't get a job?
No, John, sorry. See, I always forget what slide it's on, so that's why you need to shout. User invalid and user valid. Using these new pseudo classes in CSS, we now create the experience that we're expecting, and we create the experience we were kind of replicating and trying to recreate in JavaScript, where I'm able to this field, and CSS understands that I'm still interacting with it, I'm still inputting text, and then whenever I'm leaving this field, whenever I'm done with this field, I move to the next one, then those pseudo classes trigger. So now we're able to create that experience that we've been recreating with JavaScript forever, but now we're able to do that natively in CSS. And this is actually a really sweet just find and replace of valid and invalid to user valid and user invalid. So really cool pseudo classes that form valid, but I think this is actually low key kind of cool.
I have a question about that.
Okay.
Do you know if you can parameterize that significant amount of delay, or is it something that's like decided by the end?
Okay, the question is, can we parameterize significant amount of interaction for these pseudo classes? To my knowledge, no. It's just built into the engine. Yep. So that is for we can now do that with CSS natively, which takes us into text box trimming. I come from a design background. This is one that's, again, bothered me forever. I don't know why it is this way, but it is. Where we have two new properties called text box trim and text box edge. And if you've ever had to deal on the web, you have a sample heading. And you think, okay, the design says this text should be 42 pixels tall. That's fine. Except when you put 42 pixels into the text, you actually get, like, you expect this. You expect it to be 42 pixels based on the amount of text that you have there. But the browser actually does this. I see someone nodding. You've felt this pain before. Yes. And if you have a very scrupulous designer, there are pixels to 1 pixel of difference above and below the text. So now what do you end up doing? You end up like doing like a -1 pixel margin on the container and all this just really weird stuff that you know that just feels bad to do, but you have to. Or in some cases, you introduce a library like capsize. And with the capsize library, you're able to essentially build your whole font sizing objects. It does all the things in the background, and then it gives you some CSS like this. I don't know, if I'm stepping into this code base, I'm not touching this file. This looks awful. It looks awful. But this is what we would have to do with JavaScript to offset this weird browser issue or this weird browser consideration of having spacing above and below our text nodes. Kind of a weird thing. No rescue. But we don't have to do this anymore. We don't have to deal with really weird margin bottoms of -0.16 garbage. We don't have to deal with this. We can introduce now the text box edge and text box trim properties in CSS. When we use these two properties together, we're able now to do the same thing that Capsize.js was doing, but in a much more cohesive, coherent, and easy to understand way. So we start with the first property, text box edge. And we can put multiple values in here. But in this example, the first value of cap is defining where you want the edge of the text nodes to be. And we're saying we want the edge of these text nodes to be at the size of the capital letters. So any capital letters in this text node will define the limits of this text box edge. And then in the second argument of alphanumeric, we're essentially defining the type of content we're expecting in this text node. Like it could be alphanumeric, could be ideographic. We're defining kind of the type of content we're expecting. So we're saying define the edge of our text at the capital letter size of our alphanumeric content. So we define that with our text box edge. Then we pair that with text box trim. And we say, all right, where do we cut the space? Do we trim the space from the top, the bottom, or both? Most often you're going to need both. Maybe some instances where you need one or the other, but in this case, we're going to take the spacing on both the top and bottom of our text node, and we're going to trim both ends of that. So we're defining our edge of the text node to the capital letter of our alphanumeric content, and any spacing that's above or below that, we're going to trim and get rid of. So now when we use those two properties, what we've been ever of using the browser, what we get, where when we put 42 pixels on this sample heading, our sample heading is now taking up 42 pixels in the UI. I don't know why browsers did what they did, but 15, 20 years, 30 years later, we now have a way around that weird spacing above and below text by using text box trim and text box edge in CSS. And every designer in the world rejoices. Next one, scroll state detection is quite awesome, I think. A long time ago, CSS introduced a new position property called sticky. Position sticky. It's transformed how we have headers on every website ever for the past 15 years. Where you just start to scroll, and then once that header gets to the top of the window, it locks in place, and it stays there. Content scrolls behind it. And there's been a lot of times where that header maybe has a transparent background in the default state. And then once it actually scrolls and gets to the top, we now need to add a background color, maybe a fancy little box shadow. So as the content goes under it, it actually has a nice visual effect to it. So we would have to know whenever an element becomes stuck. We need to know when something sticky becomes stuck. And this was something missing in CSS for a really long time. So again, JavaScript. We would introduce something like intersection observers. And again, we would have to do this sort of like weird -1 margin hack as well to sort of like make sure that the element stays in view, but actually sort of triggers it as out of view. Weird stuff. But we would use this intersection observer. And then whenever we're actually using our product, scrolling, and the item gets to the top, we now shrink the size, we add a little border radius, we just do a slight transformation to it. We just toggle the class essentially. But we've had to use JavaScript to do this. We've had to add an intersection observer, which is listening as the page scrolls. So if you have a few of these on there, it gets kind of heavy, right? And again, it just doesn't feel like you should have to do this. It doesn't feel like it's the right solution. So now with the advent of container queries, there CSS to now include container type of scroll state. And we can put this on the sticky container that we have. So whenever we have a container with a position of sticky, we can define it as a container as well. And that type of container will be scroll state. So now any child element within this container can be manipulated and changed based on the scroll state of this container. We're going to look at some more code here. Hopefully have that make a little bit more sense. So we have our sticky container, and it has position of sticky, which will allow it to actually stick to our browser window wherever we want. But we define it as a CSS container with a type of scroll state. So now this container, as it scrolls, will actually trigger whether it's stuck or not stuck. And now we're able to use this new container query and listen to that scroll state of our container. So by querying the scroll state of our parent container, we can say whenever this container is stuck at the top of the window, this can be right, left, bottom, whatever. I think logical positions also work here, like block start, block end. But we can say whenever this parent container becomes stuck at the top of the window or the top of its container, we're now going to add these styles. So now we're going to add the box shadow, the border radius, so on and so forth. So we define the container type to scroll state, and now any child element within that container can now query and listen for that scroll state change. And now, fun fact, this is the exact same demo. Exact same thing, but we can now recreate this exact same experience, not with JavaScript, not with intersection observers, but with CSS natively on the UI side of the browser. So again, quite powerful and changes how we work on the front end. Because now, again, more and more JavaScript is getting pulled out of the UI and being pushed out of the front end and into more different areas of the web. And HTML and CSS are doing a lot more heavy lifting. Now, empty states is the last CSS thing we're going to look at. This one isn't new, but it's kind of new to me. And I think it's low-key awesome again. Empty is just a pseudo class in CSS that element you want that has no child nodes, has no child elements within it. So if we just picture this white background container with a series of list items in it, right? It has some padding on it and separation between all the elements in here. But what happens if there aren't any elements? Let's say you're still loading something, you're still loading a request, or still fetching, or just whatever. Like there's a million reasons why this list might be empty. So in this case, we have a grid display, we have our padding and everything on it. But if it's empty, you actually have this like accidental padding. So now you have this like weird little like white space in there that's there until either you put a loading spinner or until the content's actually populated. And again, from like I'm coming from kind of like a React background. We would do something like a check in our JSX. It's like, hey, if we don't have any items in our array, just don't render the thing or toggle the class name entirely. You have to, again, use JavaScript logic to sort of take care of this stuff for us. And it felt weird that you had to do this. Like I've written this. I've had to do this in the past because I didn't know about empty. So in this case, we would have the show class whenever something's ready, and it'd be fine. But we can now, for a long time, we've been able to use the empty pseudo class. And does the same thing. But again, it selects any element that does not have any child content within it in the DOM. So when our container is loading and fetching those list items and there's nothing rendered in that container, it's going to have a padding of 0. And then whenever there are items, then that padding is going to be reset to the 0.5 rem. Right? So this creates us the experience that we're sort of expecting, again, without having to write conditionals in our JSX or anything else. How I like to use it is with the not pseudo selector as well. And maybe this is sort of like the responsive design background, where like you sort of do mobile styles first, and as it gets kind of start small, get bigger. So I tend to write my styles first as empty, and then when it's not empty, then add those styles to it. So I go this approach. Just it fits with how I think. Doesn't matter if you go empty like this, or if you do the inverse of not empty. All good. But I just thought this was really cool. This has been around a long time. I had no idea. Pretty cool, though. So That's all the CSS stuff that we're covering. We're going to highlight a couple more things at the end that I just don't have demos and everything for. But before we get there, I want to also look at HTML, the companion to CSS. We're just going to look at a few things that are changing and adding and happening in HTML that I think are just worth reviewing. I think it was maybe last year, last year-ish, where the HTML dialog element became broadly supported. So again, we used to use JavaScript to create these like overlay modals with like the shadowy background to tint out the content, and then you had the modal in the center and all that stuff. You could do that natively in HTML now. One nice thing is this does take care of some accessibility considerations for you, not all, so you still have to be mindful of that. But one nice thing is since it's native in the browser, those accessibility considerations will gradually be patched and fixed up, and you get all that stuff for free. You don't have to wait for NPM package to update. So you can use the dialog element in HTML, and comparatively, you have a popover ability in HTML. So if you ever have like the 3-dot menu and you click that, and a little menu pops out to the side, a little popover menu. Right, again, you always turn to JavaScript for this stuff. And again, there's a lot of accessibility considerations that you have to keep in mind when building these types of interactions that now you sort of get for free in HTML. They've introduced a new popover attribute that you would assign to the actual popover content. And then on your button or your trigger element, you would just say, hey, this controls this popover target based on this ID. Pretty cool. This works really well with another CSS feature called anchor positioning. We're going to briefly highlight that still. But pairing that with the popover, and you can actually position popover menus relative to the target with CSS, and no more JavaScript needed for all this kind of stuff. Really, really cool stuff. And then image lazy loading. If anyone's ever had to do anything performance-wise for their websites, for their products, undoubtedly an issue. They've been the culprit for a lot of render times, your largest content paint, all that stuff. But HTML actually has really, really good support for lazy loading our images. Again, before we used to use things like maybe intersection observers again in JavaScript. And we would add those to our images and say, all right, if the image is outside of this, outside of the viewport, let's delay rendering it until it's just about to enter the viewport, and then we'll load it. And you had to, again, use JavaScript to do all these things that now HTML can do for free for you. So you have 3 properties that I want to look at tonight. First is decoding. You have the ability to set decoding on an image to either auto, async, or synchronous. And what decoding defines is how this image should be loaded relative to other non-image content. Is this maybe like a really big hero image at the top of the page? It's a big splash image, big deal, but you have some like JavaScript stuff down here. You can use decoding to enforce that this image is loaded before some of this other non-image content out of the way. So you can choose to make it asynchronous or synchronous. I forget what auto defaults to, but you can control how this image loads relative to other non-image content. The decoding properties companion is the fetch priority property. And you can set this to auto, high, or low. And what this defines is how this image will be loaded relative to other images. So you can define how this image is loaded relative to non-image content as well as other image content. So if you have this hero image, you can say, hey, make this synchronous. This thing has to load first, and load this as a high priority thing above all the other low priority images. So you have a lot of control and granularity over how your images load now. And then lastly, you have the loading attribute as well with lazy or eager. And this replaces those intersection observers we've been writing, where if you define this as lazy and this image falls outside the viewport, the browser will delay rendering it for you and loading it until it's just about to enter the viewport, and then the browser will do the heavy lifting for you. Now, we can get into things like source sets and responsive images that help a lot with performance as well. But with these 3 properties, you can actually have an actual impact on the performance of your products that are image heavy just by using these 3 things that are in HTML, broadly supported. I think React started supporting fetch priority halfway-ish through last year. Like for a while, TypeScript wasn't seeing it or something. You can use all these, and you get performance wins and gains essentially out of the box for HTML for free. So a lot of stuff. So I want to highlight the key points again real quick, just to drive the points home. So we had the CSS alternatives where we had things like the keyword transitions, where we had interpolate size property, and we had the calc size function. Then we had the form validation, where we had the user valid and user invalid new CSS pseudo classes. We had text box trimming, to where we can manage our text nodes and how they render in the browser. We had scroll state detection, where whenever we're using sticky elements, we can now trigger whenever they're stuck. And we had the empty states. Again, not new. I just thought it was fun. You can style an element based on whether or not it has content within it. Then in HTML, you had the dialog, the popover, and image lazy loading. We have a link to the demo. There'll be a chance to download the slides at the end as well. So you'll have access to all the demos. You can look at all the code and play around with it and try some things out. So what's next? I was saying earlier tonight that every time I do this talk, it's a hard one to memorize because it changes every time I do it. If you've noticed anything with CSS over the past year or 2 years, shit's crazy. Like, it's changing all the time, new features all the time. And these are some things that I just didn't have time to cover in this talk, to put slides together for it. We have relative color syntax. If you've ever used like Sass or less, like these like CSS preprocessors, you would have functions in there for your colors like darken and lighten. So you could have like a color of red, and you could pass it into a darken function and just darken it by 10%. You always needed these preprocessors to do that, but CSS is introducing relative color syntax to where you can actually take your own colors and lighten it, saturate it, darken it, manipulate it however you need to relative to the base color. So from a design systems perspective and building color palettes and stuff, this is huge. Like, we maybe don't have to define separate hover colors and hover-based design tokens. We could probably just set the default of just darken the primary color by 10% or something like that. So really cool stuff. There is an attribute selector in CSS, ATTR function. And we would maybe use this sometimes to get like data attribute values, but it was really limited. It would only give you like a string value back, I think, and it wasn't really super useful. But this function in CSS now has been expanded to work with number types on any property in HTML. So now you can start passing in things like, numbers, IDs, strings, colors, anything like that. And you can use those in CSS based on whatever the HTML attribute value is. So quite powerful again. Lots of cool articles about this and how it can be used. CSS is getting an if function. So you'll be able to start writing conditionals in your CSS. This is like, I think it's still in in progress. I think it's maybe in like one like Canary or technology preview, something like that, if that. But you'll be able to start writing if logic in your CSS. So if CSS wasn't complicated enough, here you go. Then we have anchor positioning. I mentioned that. So again, in JavaScript, we're used to sort of like take an element and get its client bounding box to know where its top, right, and bottom edges are. And then we would calculate those values to position something next to it or above it or below it. We would use JavaScript to do all these calculations, but CSS with anchor positioning will allow us to do that natively in CSS. So we'll be able to do some really cool things like that. And yeah, we could pair this with the popover in HTML and again, rip out probably 2 separate NPM packages that are just JavaScript doing this for us. Then last thing here, we have the at starting style selector in CSS. So if you've ever, again, working in React and you've just like you insert a new component and it enters the DOM, and you want it to animate on its way in. It doesn't. You need to do some hacks to sort of like insert a new component and have it animate when it comes in. It's kind of weird, but that's just the way it happens. But CSS is introducing, or has introduced, an at selector, like a query called starting style, that will, on insert like that, it'll actually define the base style of that element, so you now can transition and animate whenever you insert something into the DOM like that. So again, less JavaScript, less hacky, more CSS-y. HTML stuff that's coming is exclusive accordions. So if you have like an FAQ with a bunch of little accordions that you can expand and open and stuff, by default now, like you can open 1 and 2 and 3 and leave them all open at one time, and that's fine. But if you've wanted to, for some reason, have only one open at a time, so if you have the first one open, you open the second one, that first one closes. It's kind of a bad UX, I think. You might want to have both open at the same time. But if you want only one open at one time, HTML will now support this for you, and you can create exclusive accordions using the details and summary elements in HTML. Speaking of accordions, if you have an accordion and it's collapsed, it's as if that content doesn't exist. So if you do a find, a search for a keyword, and it just happens to be inside of a closed accordion, your browser's not going to be able to see it. It's kind of hidden, right? HTML is introducing a feature to be able to start searching for hidden content like that. So again, quite powerful, and addresses like a real world issue, like a real world thing that we're facing, that I don't know how we got around that with JavaScript or whatever, but this will allow us to start searching for hidden content, whether it's displayed in the DOM or in the UI or not. Another one here is select menus. We're going to be able to completely customize and style select menus like this year. So that's going to be dope. So again, another JavaScript library we could probably get rid of, but we'll be able to actually start putting horizontal role elements inside of native select elements in HTML. Doesn't seem like a big deal, but as soon as you need to section content in a select menu, that breaks down, but now you can actually do that. So pretty cool. And earlier I mentioned responsive images, where you can define source sets, and you can do, I forget the term now, but you can change the type of image based on the viewport, based on the pixel density, all this stuff. You can do some really cool things with responsive images, and all that functionality is coming to responsive videos as well. The web is becoming much more video based, so you'll be able to start loading videos much more performant, and yeah, do some cool things with those. So you'll get responsive videos in the very near future as well. And that's everything I want to cover. So if you want to download the slides, have access to the demos, go for it. Connect on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to chat. I think at this point, we can open up some questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
Yes.
Is this okay, the volume of the catch box? I think it is. I have two questions. They're adjacent to each other. One is, how do you go about finding these updates on CSS? And the other one is, how can we get our hands on this type of resource as well?
Yeah. So how do we learn about these things, and then how do we start using them? I use a lot of Blue Sky. So I follow a few people, like, I only know their handles. I don't know their actual names. But Bram.us is always, he's part of like the CSS team, I think, and he's involved with doing a lot of this stuff. Rachel Andrews is another really, really good one. And then this guy, Jay Hay, he kind of takes these really cutting edge things and then does the most mind blowing things with them. So I use Blue Sky, and I just follow a bunch of these people, and they're always blue skying about it. I don't know what the verb is for Blue Sky. And then how do you actually start using it? Generally, a lot of these things will be available in a browser Safari technology preview. So it's just like Safari, but it just gives you access to like feature flags of developer tools. And you can say, hey, I want to try this CSS thing. Bam, enable. Try this one, enable. And then similarly, Chrome has a version of Chrome called Canary. And it does the same thing. You can toggle on feature flags, and it usually has these like cutting edge things that you can try out. So yeah, you can check those out.
Thank you so much.
Yep. All the way in the back there.
Didn't realize it was below. Yeah, I just like these features are really nice, but I've been using frontend for a while and haven't heard of them. And I was curious, do you feel like component libraries like ShadCN or others and LLMs are maybe slowing down the adoption of these things? Because in the end, like there's a lot of the box.
Yep.
So then we rely on these things, and if those things don't use them, then you're stuck not using them.
That's interesting. I haven't really considered that. I don't know. I would think like some of these component libraries are so significant that they would actually maybe be a driving force behind it. Like I know, like I follow this one called Aria Kit, and it does a lot of like really cool like cutting edge things, and like I've learned a lot of things from that. And I think those communities start then advocating for some of these features. So I think that can actually be a bit of a driving change for it. I think maybe they might impair adoption because they hide the features from you and you're not actually like learning them, doing them yourself because they're just sort of like baked in. So maybe they can help move them forward, but also kind of limiting kind of the exposure to it. But yeah, haven't considered that. That's an interesting thought.
All right, thank you.
Yep. Could you slide away from the QR codes? Awesome, thank you.
To the person raising their hand, can you look at me? Because
Thank
I'm
you.
going to throw you the box.
Any other questions?
Can you go back to the QR codes? I think there's still a few people trying to QR code. Yeah. Awesome, thank you. Yep. Yeah, we got a couple up here.
I don't want to throw it at their heads.
Yeah, turn around. Yep. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, all right. Hello. Yeah, thanks for the great presentation. Actually,
Thank you.
really interesting. And one even in my mind for the whole thing, you were talking a lot about features migrating basically from JS to HTML, CSS. Have you considered adding SVG to this equation, like employing it for some visual effects, scaling layouts, stuff like this? So like data visualization applications, but also I'm very interested in like broader applications. So I wonder what's your opinion on SVG?
I think SVG is amazing. And I think like I was just at Tampere.js and there's this guy, Fotis, who did a whole talk on just SVGs and optimizing and where they're going. And it was really, really, really interesting. He works at Volt, so Volt's doing some really cool stuff with this. And you'll soon be able to start using SVGs in really, really incredible ways, but it's still kind of like waiting for support and all that stuff. But outside of data viz, I haven't really thought about how SVG can be leveraged to replicate or recreate some of these user experiences. At least in my experience, I've always turned to JavaScript to handle them in the past and haven't really considered SVG in that way. I imagine as SVG's feature set grows, we'll find more use cases for them, but I haven't thought about them in these examples.
All right, thanks.
Yep. Any other questions? Yeah.
Since you've started this new job,
Yes.
you have to take on all this legacy CSS and other things. And I'm wondering if you found a way to understand what the purpose of it was and whether it works well, because when you compare with HTML and JavaScript, you can sort of tell, oh, this is what it's trying to do, and that's good. But with CSS, I only know of put lots of comments in that you like to bundle or strip out and load the HTML and dev tools and try to find where the declarations show up.
Yeah. Understanding legacy CSS. In my position with design systems, I'm mostly dealing with components. So everything is kind of self-contained using styled components. So we have a button for the React component, and then we have a separate button.styles or whatever, button.module CSS or whatever. So kind of all the CSS lives next to the component. So it's pretty easy to sort of mental map it. That said, there's still like class names that seem maybe not intuitive to me. So it's mostly just a matter of like in Cursor or just in my code editor, having the HTML and the CSS open side by side and kind of like making those connections myself so I can sort of see how they relate together. Because if I just look at CSS, it doesn't make sense. If I just look at the HTML, it doesn't really make sense either. So I have to see them together. And then just time. Yep. Anything else? We have a lot of time tonight, I think. So we can go into discussions. We can dig into whatever. Anything else?
First of all, thank you for the presentation. The ones you presented in the beginning, more CSS, are they supported right now across the browsers, or what's the support?
Most of them have pretty broad support. Empty for sure. I think the form validation is safe to use. Scroll state detection is quite close, I think. You're going to have pretty good support for most of them. I don't know what your own support requirements are, but I think most of them have at least some of the 4 major browser support in there. I've been told before I use screenshot in this talk, but again, see that if I have to also update the can I use preview every talk, like that gets kind of heavy. But I would imagine this year of the things we covered tonight in like the first section, I would imagine you can start using those this year in production pretty safely, unless you have like really broad support requirements where you need to support some extra mobile browsers or anything like that. But if you're mostly just supporting relatively recent Chrome, Safari, Firefox, Edge, you should be safe. Yep. Anything else? Is that the last one tonight? Okay, awesome. Well, hey, let's connect on LinkedIn. Can't anymore. That's cool, but we can chat after. I'm always happy to chat about this stuff. Like I said, I love HTML, I love CSS. They're my 2 favorite parts of the web. And yeah, I think we can just enjoy the rest of the evening. So, Yuho, do you have anything?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, HTML CSS really cool. I think we forgot to do something. So I think we have to
Oh,
So thanks for joining us. The next meetup is actually exactly in 1 month, 24th of March. You will get some email about it. I don't else to say really. Thanks to Wunderdog. We even have
more beer.
we have Mr. Salad before we go. But that
awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.